I had been standing in the great hall of the Vorzeth Imperial Court for exactly 47 minutes before anyone acknowledged that I existed. That was normal. That was how it always went. The hall was enormous, carved from a single piece of violet stone that the Vorzeth had mined from the core of a dead moon 3,000 years before humans had figured out how to build a wheel. The ceiling stretched so far above us that the upper arches disappeared into soft, artificial cloud. Bioluminescent panels floated near the walls like trapped stars, pulsing in colors that had no names in any human language. The Vorzeth themselves moved through the space the way water moves, graceful, unhurried, completely certain that the universe had arranged itself for their convenience. I stood near the eastern pillar with a crystal goblet in my hand, and watched them the way I had watched everything in this court for 11 months, quietly, carefully, without looking like I was doing either. My name is Kale Durin. I was 34 years old, which meant I was, by Vorzeth standards, somewhere between a child and a mayfly. I had short dark hair, 2 ordinary eyes, and no bioluminescent markings anywhere on my body, which the Vorzeth found either amusing or mildly unsettling, depending on how much they had drunk. I was, by every visible measure, the least impressive person in the room. That was by design. Before I came to this court, before the compact of stars and the arrangements that followed, I spent 14 years in the Reclamation Corps. We were the people who went into situations that had already gone wrong and made them stop being wrong. We worked in small teams, in difficult places, in the kind of conditions that do not appear in recruitment materials. I learned, over those 14 years, that the most useful thing a person can be is invisible. Not literally, just beneath notice. The kind of presence a room absorbs without registering. I had been invisible in this court since my first day. It required almost no effort at all. The Vorzeth called me the princess's mate, which was a diplomatic term that did not mean what it sounds like. It meant I had been assigned to her household as a gesture of political goodwill, a symbol of humanity's willingness to participate in the hegemony's cultural traditions. There were 14 other human consorts distributed across various noble houses. We had a quiet communication network among ourselves, maintained through channels no one had thought to monitor, because no one had thought we were interesting enough to organize. Princess Sarathva was standing across the hall, deep in conversation with 3 members of the Hegemony Council. She was tall, as all Vorzeth were, with pale silver skin that shifted faintly toward blue when she was thinking. Her markings ran down her neck and along her arms in patterns that indicated her bloodline, her rank, and something about her temperament that I had spent 3 months learning to read. She was, by any honest assessment, brilliant. She had managed the political dynamics of this court since she was what the Vorzeth considered a teenager, which put her age somewhere around 160 years. She had never lost a political contest. She had never needed to be cruel, because she had never encountered anything she could not simply outmaneuver. She had looked in my direction exactly twice since I arrived, both times with the pleasant, distant expression a person uses when they glance at a piece of furniture they quite like, but have no particular plans for. I finished my drink, and accepted another from a passing server, and continued watching the room. The rite of consort happened every cycle, which translated to roughly every 8 months in Earth time. It was the court's formal mechanism for evaluating the consorts of the noble houses, a public ceremony where each one was brought forward, assessed, and either elevated in status or released. Released was the gentle word. What it meant, in practice, was that a human being ended up far from home, with no diplomatic standing, and no protection in a star system controlled entirely by people who viewed them as a passing curiosity. I had survived one rite already. That one had been simple. Sarathva had said a few words about my function as a cultural liaison and moved on. This one, I had been told privately by another consort in the network, was expected to be different. The council had been pushing the noble houses to make stronger statements about the hierarchy, to make the positioning clear, to remind everyone present exactly where humanity stood in relation to the hegemony. Sarathva was nothing if not politically responsive. When my name was called, I walked to the center of the hall, the way I always moved, steadily, without hurry, with the particular kind of stillness that people who have spent time in dangerous places develop without quite realizing it. The court gathered. There were perhaps 800 people present. The murmur dropped away as I reached the open space before the raised platform where Sarathva stood. She looked at me the way you look at something you are about to explain. She began with facts. I had expected that. The most precise kind of humiliation always begins with facts, because facts cannot be argued with, and they set the tone for everything that follows. She spoke about human lifespan, 40 to 90 years, compared to Vorzeth spans of 4 to 600. She noted human physical limitations with the tone of someone reading from a technical document. No natural armor, limited sensory range, moderate strength relative to body size, high vulnerability to environmental conditions. She mentioned that humans required sleep for approximately 1/3 of every day, which produced a ripple of something through the crowd that was not quite laughter, but was adjacent to it. She spoke about humanity's history, not all of it, just the parts that served the point she was making. She mentioned the resource conflicts of the 21st century, the near collapses, the decades during which humanity had been its own greatest threat. She mentioned the outer colonies, and how they had entered the hegemony's sphere without resistance, how the formal compact had been signed without a single military engagement, how humanity had calculated survival and chosen accordingly. She was not wrong about any of it. That was the careful part. She had built the picture from true things, arranged to produce a particular impression. The crowd was attentive in the way crowds become attentive when they sense that something is being concluded. Then she used the word. In Vorzeth, it was Vereth Sol. It referred to a creature kept within a household, not a servant who has function, and not a guest who has standing. Something maintained, something pleasant to have around, something that exists within a space entirely defined by another's choices, and has never been, and will never be capable of anything else. She said it clearly, in the formal register used for official declarations, so that there would be no ambiguity about what she meant, and no question about whether the court had heard. The silence that followed was the silence of 800 people waiting for a small thing to accept what it had just been told it was. I reached into the inner fold of my formal robes. The fold was positioned where it was, because I had spent 2 months studying the Vorzeth security protocols used at court functions. Their scanning systems were thorough and well-maintained, and calibrated with precision for Vorzeth physiology, Vorzeth materials, and Vorzeth weapons, which were, without exception, energy-based. The idea of a non-energy weapon had not been a practical security consideration in the hegemony for approximately 900 years, because no species they had encountered in 900 years used one. I drew my grandfather's blade. Carbon steel, 19 centimeters, with a handle worn smooth by 3 generations of hands. It had no power cell. It produced no energy bloom, no resonance signature, no detectable field of any kind. It was, by the standards of this court, technologically invisible. I held it flat across both palms and said nothing. The sound that went through the room was not a gasp exactly. It was something quieter than that, and more unsettling. The collective recalibration of 800 people who had just seen something they had no prepared response for. They knew what a blade was. Their museums had them. Their historical records described entire ages of them. But there is a difference, a very significant difference, between knowing that a thing exists and standing in the same room with one held by someone who is clearly comfortable holding it. I let them sit with that for a moment. Then I spoke. I used the formal register, because I had spent 4 months learning it specifically for a moment like this, and I wanted every word to be perfectly clear. I told them about human history, not the version Sarathva had just presented, the version told from inside it. The version where a species without armor, without venom, without any of the natural advantages that made survival straightforward, looked at an indifferent universe and decided to continue anyway. The version where that same species, after nearly ending itself multiple times through its own mistakes, got back up, looked at what had gone wrong, and changed. Not because it was easy, because we are, at some fundamental level, incapable of accepting that something cannot be solved. I told them about the outer colonies, and why they had submitted to the hegemony without fighting. Not because humanity could not fight, because humanity looked at the tactical situation. 3 internal crises, 2 active reconstruction zones, a fleet that was capable, but not matched against a 600-year military infrastructure, and made the calculation that engagement would be suboptimal. That was the word I used, suboptimal. The word of a species that ran the numbers and made a decision, not the word of a species that had no other choice. I told them that I had been in this court for 11 months. During those 11 months, because I am human, and because humans do not stop assessing their environment simply because someone tells them they are safe, I had done the following things. I had identified 43 security vulnerabilities in the court's standard protocols. I had memorized the patrol schedules of the guard rotations on 6 shifts. I had cataloged the political fault lines between the 7 major factions represented in this hall, including the 3 that were currently in quiet conflict with each other over succession rights that had not yet become public. I had learned the structural tolerances of the primary load-bearing arches in this room, because in my former work, knowing how a space fails was sometimes as important as knowing how it functions. I had done none of this because I was ordered to. I had no orders regarding any of it. I did it because I am human. And humans, in any environment, in any circumstance, in any room where we have been placed and told to stand quietly and look decorative, watch and learn and remember. It is not a choice we make. It is what we are. It is what 11 months of stone tools and ice ages and centuries of working out how to survive things that should have finished us made us into. I looked at Sarathva directly. I told her, calmly and without any heat at all, that I was not a kept creature. I was a patient one. And patience, I said, was something my species had developed into an art form long before we knew there was anyone else in the galaxy to be patient toward. Then I set the blade down on the steps of her platform, turned around, and walked back to my place by the eastern pillar. The hall was completely silent. I picked up a fresh goblet from a server who had frozen mid-step and was staring at me with all 4 of his eyes. I drank from it. I waited. The silence lasted for a long time, longer than any silence I had heard in that court before. When Sarathva spoke again, her voice had changed in a way that I noticed immediately, and that I suspect most of the room also noticed. It was not afraid. The Vorzeth are not an easily frightened species, and she was not an easily frightened person, but it was different. It was the voice of someone who had been playing one game and had just realized, with complete clarity, that the other player had been playing a different one. She did not release me. She did not elevate me either, not that evening. What she did was close the ceremony without further comment, and allow the court to dissolve into the careful, busy silence of 800 people who had a great deal to quietly discuss. She found me later, near the end of the evening, when the hall had thinned out, and the floating light panels had dimmed to their evening settings. She stood beside me without preamble, and asked, in a voice that was entirely private, how long I had been watching them. I told her the truth. Since the first day, all of us, every human in every room in every star system the hegemony had ever allowed us access to. It was not a strategy that anyone had designed or directed. It was simply what we did. We entered spaces where we were not considered significant, and we paid very close attention, because that is what you do when you are small, and the world around you is large, and you intend to still be here tomorrow. She was quiet for a while after that. The following week, my designation in the court records was changed. The word Varathsal was removed. In its place was a Vorzeth term that translates, approximately, to First Contact Intelligence Liaison. I was given a seat at the strategy briefings, a real seat, with a nameplate. 3 members of the Hegemony Council objected formally. 4 voted in favor of the change. Sarathva cast the deciding vote and said, when asked to explain her reasoning, that the hegemony had been making a consistent error regarding the human delegation, and that she preferred to correct errors before they became expensive. I have been at that table for 6 months now. I bring my grandfather's blade to every meeting. I set it on the table in front of me when I sit down, and I have never once been asked to put it away. Nobody in that room will ever again use the word Varathsal in my presence. Not because I threatened them. Because I showed them, quietly and without any violence at all, that the thing they had decided I was, and the thing I actually am, were not the same thing, and that the difference between those 2 things was something they could not afford to keep misunderstanding. The blade stays in its place on the table. It has never needed to do anything else.